Cold War. The Cold War was already beginning just as World War II was coming to a close. Unlike traditional wars, where belligerents are firing upon one another, in the Cold War it was more like a cold stare. If anyone has ever given you the cold shoulder or a cold stare, you know that the potential is there for a confrontation. This was the case between particularly the United States and the Soviet Union following World War II. As the Soviets attempted to spread communism around the globe, America was dedicated to keeping this from happening, from containing the spread of communism. In many ways, the stage was set for the Cold War during World War II. If you remember, Russia was an uneasy ally. Its communism set it apart drastically from the other allies, like the United States and Britain. And yet, as long as Adolf Hitler was our common enemy, we had something to bind us together. Once that common enemy was out of the picture, our differences came into a more sharp contrast. With the end of World War II, we were already disagreeing with the Soviets on a number of issues. One was what to do with Poland after World War II. Poland was seen by the Soviets as a valuable buffer zone. In the event that Germany or another nation were to ever attack Russia again, Poland would be very important, serving as a buffer zone. So the Soviets wanted to ensure that they had a communist and Soviet-friendly government in Poland. On the other hand, other allies like the United States wanted self-determination for the people of Poland. Germany was another issue. As the Allies divided control over different parts of Germany after World War II, Germany ended up being divided into East Germany under Soviet control and West Germany controlled by the other Allies. There was also a disagreement over the matter of reparations, with the United States wanting to be more lenient in allowing Germany to rebuild. The technology that came out of World War II also set the stage for the Cold War. As you recall, the United States developed the first atomic bombs during World War II with the Manhattan Project. So during the Cold War, the arms race was on. There was competition on both sides to produce bigger, better nuclear weapons the fastest. The United States' official policy towards communism was that of containment. That can be seen in the Truman Doctrine. When other places around the world were threatened by communist takeovers, such as the case with Greece and Turkey, the United States was committed to intervening in order to contain the spread of communism. The rationale behind the Marshall Plan was to fight communism with economic warfare. The idea was that third world nations were particularly vulnerable to a communist takeover because they had problems and were looking for an answer. According to the Marshall Plan, we would send economic aid to these third world countries in order to keep them from being so vulnerable to communism. In the case of the Berlin airlift, we were sending economic aid to Germany. Keep in mind that East Germany was controlled by the Soviets and the capital of Germany lay within East Germany. It too was divided into two areas, East and West Berlin. In order to resupply the people of West Berlin, we had to resort to an airlift because we were not welcomed traveling by ground. This Cold War standoff gave rise to a new system of alliances. On the one hand, there was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where nations such as the U.S. promised to defend one another in the event of an attack by communist nations. The communist counterpart was the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War escalated in 1949, especially because of a couple key events. For one thing, China fell to communism. That was an alarming event to the United States. Such a large country becoming communist when we were trying to contain the spread of communism around the world. It was also this year when the Soviets developed an atomic bomb of their own. As I said, the arms race was on. We would soon develop a bigger bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Here at home in the United States, there was yet another round of the Red Scare. This fear of communism, not only the threat of communism spreading abroad, but also of having communist spies here in the United States threatening to overthrow our government. Senator Joseph McCarthy was instrumental in adding to the suspicion of a communist infiltration in the United States government. You can also read about examples such as the HUAC, where Congress was investigating un-American activities. There was the Hollywood Blacklist, where people working in Hollywood suspected of communism or communist sympathies were put on a blacklist, sometimes with more justification than with others. There were some convictions to come out of this Red Scare. Individuals like Alger Hiss and Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the Rosenbergs, were executed. For the most part, the Red Scare, much like the Salem witch trials of the colonial period, was a case of the fear outgrowing the actual threat. Were there communists in America? Absolutely. Were there some communist spies threatening national security? Absolutely. But was everyone accused of being a communist threat to the nation actually guilty? No. This is why Arthur Miller wrote the novel The Crucible at this time. Although it was set in colonial Salem, Massachusetts, a story about the Salem witch trials, he intended for it to be a commentary on society of his day. Although the overall conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, between communism and democracy, can appropriately be described as a Cold War, there were also hot wars within this period. They can only be understood within the context of the larger Cold War. One such example is the Korean War. In 1950, when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, attempting to reunite the nation as one communist country, the United States, in cooperation with the newly created United Nations, sort of a take on the League of Nations that had failed, worked with the United Nations to stop North Korea's takeover. The war ended basically in a stalemate, basically as things had been before, with the dividing line at the 38th parallel. But true to our policy of containment, we had at least stopped the growth of communism in North Korea. Vietnam was very similar, except that it wasn't resolved nearly as quickly. In this lecture, I'll just lay some background information about the conflict in Vietnam, but this being America's longest war lasting into the 1970s, we'll have to take up the story in a later lecture. Prior to 1945, Vietnam was known as French Indochina, a part of the French Empire, a colony of France. The Vietnamese people had been resisting French control, and after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they were able to drive out the French. A leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh came into power in North Vietnam as a communist leader. He led the NLF, or the Northern Liberation Front, in an attempt to extend their control over South Vietnam, much like the situation with Korea wanting to reunite the entire nation of Vietnam as a communist country. According to the domino theory held by many Americans, although some places as far away as Vietnam seems very far removed from American interest, the idea was that if communism spread anywhere in the world, it was like a domino effect. It would spread farther and farther, and the next thing you know, yes, it's a very near threat to our interests. Our involvement in the conflict in Vietnam began slowly. During the 1960s, under the Kennedy administration, we began sending small numbers of advisors to assist the South Vietnamese in resisting the communist North Vietnamese threat. But during the Johnson administration, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, our involvement gradually escalated. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Congress authorized the President to use necessary force in Vietnam. This was not technically a declaration of war, but from this point on, we did continue to send more and more ground troops into Vietnam. As we'll see later, the war dragged on and was a very difficult war to wage. Stay tuned on that. Back to the Soviets. In the 1950s, the Cold War, of course, continued and intensified with developments like the launching of the Sputnik in 1957. When the Soviets launched this first satellite, it alarmed the United States that we were perhaps falling behind in the space race. This wasn't just about bragging rights. Keep in mind, there's a Cold War context. The space race was very much linked to the arms race because satellites could be used for military purposes. In 1959 was the U-2 incident, where an American spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory. These were, of course, very tense moments in the Cold War. There were times when Americans feared that the Cold War might suddenly develop into a traditional hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were also some incidents in Latin America where the Cold War seemed to hit particularly close to home and threatened to erupt into a dangerous global conflict. During the Kennedy administration, there was an attempt to assist in an overthrow of Castro's communist government in Cuba with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. In 1962 is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In this incident, Soviets were planting missiles in Cuba, which is dangerously close to the United States. During this diplomatic nightmare, many Americans were basically holding their breath, wondering when we would both blow each other off the map. Of course, this was resolved and the Cold War continued. There were also hot wars in the Middle East following World War II. One example would be the Iranian Revolution, with its ties to the Cold War conflict. The Iranians had come to resent Western influence when they felt they were caught in the middle of a tug of war between the Soviets and the U.S. In the late 70s, the Shah of Iran was overthrown by the Khomeini government, and then began the American hostage crisis, which lasted until the beginning of the Reagan administration. Much of the hot war conflict in the Middle East can be tied to soon after World War II with the establishment of the nation of Israel. Let's begin with some background information about the history of the Jewish people. In Old Testament times, of course, they spent some time in bondage in Egypt and then returned to their homeland in Palestine. They were under Roman rule, and in 70 AD were dispersed around the world. Palestine was under British control between the world wars. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was growing interest in the Zionist movement, an attempt for Jewish people to return to Palestine and establish a Jewish state. Remember what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust in World War II? In 1948, Britain, in cooperation with the United Nations, set aside a portion of Palestine as a new Israeli state. Islamic Arab Palestinians from the area certainly resented the nation of Israel and immediately attempted to wipe them off the map. This newly established nation, which appeared very small and vulnerable, was immediately attacked by Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. It looked like they didn't stand a chance. But nevertheless, the new nation of Israel was victorious and actually expanded their territory beyond what had been granted by the United Nations. In 1967 was the Six-Day War, where Israel again was fighting against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In this war, Israel took territory in the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the West Bank, tripling their territory in an amazing defeat against their enemies. In 1973, Israel again found itself at war with Egypt and Syria in the Yom Kippur War. This was the time of the oil crisis where we certainly felt the effects of the conflict here in the United States. OPEC was controlling the crisis of oil, of course. The price of oil skyrocketed in the United States, resulting in an oil shortage. There was pressure through OPEC to keep the United States out of Israeli conflicts to discourage us from siding with the Israelis. With the Camp David Accords in the late 1970s, President Carter began a series of attempts to work out terms of peace between Israel and their Arab neighbors. By inviting leaders of Israel and Egypt together, they negotiated terms of Israeli withdrawal from Sinai in return for peace. Similar efforts have been repeated ever since that time. There continue to be guerrilla attacks from the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Their continued efforts to exchange territory for peace haven't been able to resolve the situation. The ongoing threats to Israel's existence as a nation are about both territory and religious beliefs. Of course, you can read in the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, about Israel being God's chosen nation. The Jewish people certainly claim that status, and many Christians believe that the United States should support Israel for that reason. Of course, many of their neighbors in the Middle East, being Muslims, do not view Israel as God's chosen people. They instead believe that they should reclaim the territory.